In the east of England, there are villages where the fields have been planted and harvested for more than 1,000 years. The names are old, the roads are older, and beneath the soil are the bones of people once imagined as invaders, strangers and conquerors from across the North Sea. For generations, the story seems simple. Rome collapsed. Britain weakened. Germanic warriors arrived in ships. The native Britons were pushed aside, erased, or driven west. Then centuries later, the Normans came and buried the Anglo-Saxons beneath another conquest. It was a clean story. Too clean. Because modern DNA has begun to reveal something far more complicated. The Anglo-Saxons did not simply replace the people who were already there. The Britons did not vanish from the land. And the Anglo-Saxons, supposedly conquered and absorbed after 1066, never truly disappeared. Their trace is still there, in the language, in the place names, in the shape of the countryside, and most quietly in the genomes of people living in England today. But this creates a problem. If the native Britons survived, why did their language vanish across so much of England? Why did the maps remember Germanic settlers more clearly than the people who had lived there for centuries? And how could a migration that was not total replacement still transform an island so completely? The answer is not a simple invasion. It is something slower, something more unsettling. A story of collapse, opportunity, power, and survival, where one people did not erase another in blood, but remade them in identity. For a long time, the Anglo-Saxon arrival was treated almost like a historical flood. One world ended, another washed over it. The Roman province of Britannia had been tied to an imperial system for nearly 4 centuries. Its towns, roads, taxes, laws, villas, armies, and markets all depended on the machinery of Rome. When that machinery withdrew, in the early 5th century, Britain was not simply left independent. It was left exposed. The old elite still existed. Romano-British leaders still claimed authority. They still inherited the prestige of Rome. But prestige could not repair broken trade networks. It could not pay soldiers. It could not defend every coast, every road, every frontier. Into this weakness came raiders from across the North Sea. Saxons had already been attacking the eastern shores during the late Roman period. They knew the coast. They knew the rivers. They knew the island was vulnerable. And when local British rulers needed warriors to fight enemies from the north and west, they made a dangerous bargain. They invited some of these Germanic fighters in. What began as military help became settlement. What began as payment became land. And what began as temporary service became permanent power. Later writers turned this into a story of betrayal and conquest. Mercenaries became warlords. Warlords became kings. Families followed. Villages appeared. New names settled onto old landscapes. The traditional version was brutal and decisive. The Anglo-Saxons came. The Britons fled, and England was born from replacement. But the evidence never fit that neatly. There were signs of violence, yes. Signs of displacement, signs of cultural rupture. Yet there were also signs of continuity. Fields remained in use. Communities adapted. Local bloodlines survived. The real mystery was not whether the Anglo-Saxons arrived. They did. The mystery was how they changed almost everything without replacing everyone. The strangest evidence was not hidden in a laboratory at first. It was written across the landscape. In much of eastern and southern England, the old Celtic names nearly disappeared. Rivers, settlements, fields, and kingdoms took on Germanic forms. Essex, Sussex, Wessex. The names themselves preserved the memory of Saxon expansion. East Anglia preserved the name of the Angles. Even the word England came from them. Language should have been messier than that. When two populations live together for centuries, traces usually remain. Loanwords survive. Place names linger. The old speech hides in the names of hills, streams, farms, and boundaries. But across the Anglo-Saxon heartlands, Celtic influence on Old English was surprisingly thin. The map looked like conquest. The language looked like erasure. And yet the ground told a more complicated story. Archaeology did not reveal one single invasion sweeping across Britain in a clean line. It showed different patterns in different places. Some cemeteries contained continental burial customs. Some settlements suggested new arrivals, living beside existing communities. In certain regions, there were signs of violence and disruption. In others, the change appeared slower, almost domestic. People were not just fighting. They were farming, marrying, working land that had already been worked before them. The great treasures of Sutton Hoo later revealed that Anglo-Saxon England was not a crude frontier of raiders, but a connected, wealthy, ambitious world. Its rulers traded across seas. Its elites displayed power through ships, weapons, gold, and ceremony. But beneath that splendor remained the unanswered question. If the Britons were still there, why did they stop sounding like Britons? Something had happened that was deeper than migration, but less complete than extermination. And for centuries, no one could measure it directly. Then the evidence changed. For most of history, the Anglo-Saxon question had been argued through texts, graves, pottery, weapons, and language. Each source carried clues. Each source also carried uncertainty. A brooch could travel without a person. A burial custom could be copied. A language could be imposed by power, not numbers. DNA made the problem measurable. When ancient genomes from Anglo-Saxon period cemeteries were compared with earlier British remains and with modern populations, the old replacement story began to fracture. The people buried in early medieval England were not all one thing. Some carried strong ancestry linked to populations across the North Sea. Others looked more closely connected to the earlier inhabitants of Britain. Many showed evidence of mixture. The result was not a vanished native population. It was a blended one. In parts of eastern England, modern people still carry a substantial genetic signal connected to those continental migrants. In some regions, especially in the east and southeast, that ancestry can form a major share of the modern genetic landscape. But it exists alongside deep continuity from the people who had lived in Britain before the Anglo-Saxon migration. This was the contradiction finally exposed. Culturally, the Anglo-Saxon transformation looked overwhelming. Genetically, it looked incomplete. The Britons had not disappeared. Their descendants were inside the new society, inside the same villages, inside the population that eventually called itself English. The old question had been whether the Anglo-Saxons conquered Britain or merged with it. The DNA suggested something more precise and more uncomfortable. They conquered enough to change the rules of belonging. Then the people who survived learned to live inside those rules. This is what made the Anglo-Saxon story so powerful. It was not only a movement of people, it was a movement of status. A new elite arrived, with weapons kinship networks, land hunger, and a political culture built around loyalty to war leaders. In the unstable world after Rome, that mattered. The old Romano-British order had lost the structures that once protected it. The new settlers brought a different structure, smaller and harsher, but effective. Power gathered around the hall, around the lord, around the men who could defend land, reward followers, and punish enemies. In that world, identity could change faster than ancestry. A Briton who entered an Anglo-Saxon household, served an Anglo-Saxon lord, married into an Anglo-Saxon community, or raised children under Anglo-Saxon authority, might leave descendants who no longer saw themselves as British at all. Their bloodline continued. Their older identity did not. This explains the great contradiction. The language shift did not require every Briton to be killed or expelled. It required the language of power to become the language of survival. Once landholding law, protection, marriage, and inheritance ran through Anglo-Saxon systems, speaking like the rulers became more than convenience. It became a future. And then history added another reversal. The Anglo-Saxons themselves were later conquered. Vikings took their kingdoms. Normans took their throne. French became the language of court and aristocracy after 1066. Yet the deeper Anglo-Saxon foundation endured. The villages remained. The shires remained. Much of the everyday language remained. The people who had once absorbed the Britons were not erased by the Normans. They absorbed the conquerors into a country already remade. DNA did not reveal a pure origin. It revealed something stranger. England was born from survival under pressure. So the old image of the Anglo-Saxons was never enough. They were not simply invaders who swept an island clean. They were not a vanished people buried beneath later conquests. And they were not a pure ancestral beginning untouched by everything that came before. They were something more historically difficult. A ruling culture that became a population. A migrant identity that absorbed older bloodlines. A conquered people who continued not by remaining unchanged, but by becoming the structure into which later conquerors had to settle. The Britons survived, but not always as Britons. The Anglo-Saxons were conquered, but not truly removed. And England emerged from that tension not as a clean replacement, but as a long negotiation between ancestry and power, memory, and language, blood, and belonging. This is why the DNA matters. It does not make the past simpler. It makes it harder to look away from. It shows that history is not only written by the people who win battles. It is also carried by those who survive them, quietly marry into the new order, give their children new names, and disappear into the identity that replaced their own. Somewhere in eastern England, a village still carries a name spoken in an old Germanic tongue. Beneath it may lie Roman roads, British fields, Anglo-Saxon graves, Viking scars, and Norman walls. No single people owns the whole story, but one transformation still shapes it. The Anglo-Saxons never replaced everyone. They never completely vanished. They became the language of a country, the bones beneath its institutions, and the hidden inheritance of people who may never know how much of the conquest still lives inside them.